We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Bonjour à tous.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie von Lackey, and I co-direct the Network for Strategic Analysis. I'm a professor at Queen's University.
Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the
event on this territory and that we are all here gathered today. C'est la deuxième édition.
This is the second edition of the annual colloquium of our Network for Strategic Analysis. Last year, we were together only virtually. This year, we're finding ourselves in a hybrid fashion. Some people are here in the room with me, and some people are with us virtually. It's a transition, shall we call it? A transition that's exciting and that is also in line with today's theme that also has to do with transition. The theme is what's next, managing traditional and new threats through international cooperation. And before carrying on, I want to tell people that are joining us virtually that we have simultaneous interpretation. So if you are with us virtually, please select the language of your choice, either English or French. And for those people that are in the room, you, of course, can ask your questions here in the room in English or French. So whether you're joining us in person or virtually, please feel free to speak English or French.
I want to tell you a little bit about our network, the Network for Strategic Analysis, because it's been a really interesting and exciting adventure to be able to work with such fantastic collaborators, colleagues, and students. The Network for Strategic Analysis is one of the MINDS Collaborative Network grants. It receives its funding from the Department of National Defense. Et c'est un partenariat qui a été établi entre l'université.
And this is a partnership that was created between Queen's University and UQAM. So it's a joint project. Professor Justin Massey and myself launched this project with people from Bishops, Laval University,
et le professeur Théo
and
Boucantine de l'Université Montréal.
the University of
Et donc,
Montreal.
nous avons établi une
So we
programmation
created a program that aims to research three broader themes. Firstly, cooperation amongst larger powers, then multilateral cooperation, especially in the context of international organizations, and finally, strengthening military capacity. We are very proud that the Network for Strategic Analysis is the first bilingual network in the genre. As you can see, our program is always fully bilingual. It is part of our DNA to provide bilingual content for our community. We also have three main goals. Our goals are firstly to engage researchers. That is done by experts in security and defense, both in Canada and abroad.
Forms to do so, as well as our events. We also want to disseminate that research to specific audiences, much like other MINDS collaborative networks. Our goal is really to translate the research that we do into actionable policy recommendation and advice for government stakeholders, for members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And we also seek to inform public debates on defense issues. Our third objective, and in our heart, really the most important one, is to train the next generation of experts. And I can't underscore how important that part of our mission has been in the last 2 years, especially in the middle of a pandemic. You all know how hard going virtual has been on our student community. And I think I speak for all of us here that we're just so thrilled to be able to meet these students that we've been working with over the past couple of years, and to provide a true opportunity for networking. Even though virtual platforms have really allowed us to continue our work on the research front and the dissemination front, when it comes to training, that personal contact is extremely important. And so I want to welcome our emerging scholars in the room, and also say hi to those joining us virtually, and express my sincere hope that we'll get to meet you in person as well soon. Ce que j'espère aussi avec le réseau d'analyse.
What I also hope with the Network for Strategic Analysis, and I know that this is something that's shared by Justin, is to not only create a network, but really create a community. And when we look around us in this room, I think we can understand that we are trying to integrate academics, practitioners, and students. And when students speak, as they will do later on this afternoon, they will be facing this community.
Building a community where we really seek the integration of students, practitioners, and academic experts and researchers from other backgrounds. And that when the students come up here to present their work later on, they're really facing a tribe of mentors. This is what community is all about, is to create these ties and to sustain them over time. Avant de vous parler de la thématique.
Before moving on to today's theme, I wanted to underscore the tremendous work that's been done by the network's team. As you know, organizing events, especially in the midst of a pandemic, is really difficult. You have to be ready to pivot and adapt very quickly. Therefore, I would like to thank the entire team behind the Network for Strategic Analysis, with a special thanks to Anaïs, who is a PhD student and has done the heavy lifting in terms of communication. So thank you, Anaïs. Earlier, I spoke to the transition to the hybrid platform, and I was drawing a parallel with the transition across the world. And really, that's what we are noticing. The transition based on COVID is quite uneven. We've seen diplomatic interactions in the context of social distancing that hasn't always been easy. And in terms of strengthening collaboration, it has not been beneficial.
Complex global challenge that states and international organizations have to manage on top of the others. An additional global challenge also in a context where there is more great power tension and more obstacles to reaching solutions collaboratively in the international arena. We've seen tenser relations. We've seen states turn inward in response to COVID, looking after their own national interests. We've seen vaccine diplomacy emerging as a strategy that states have adopted. But we've also seen some collaboration. So today is a time to take stock of how states have responded to COVID-19, especially in the first panel, and to better understand this process of adaptation, because even though we're still very much in this transition, I think there are still broader lessons to be learned when it comes to adaptation. Dans la compétition.
In this competition between powerful states, many things are intertwined. You certainly have been looking at academic research and the media, such as I have, where there's a lot of talk about the US retreat, a changing American leadership. We're talking about China that's ready to redefine its role on the international stage. And we're also talking about Russia that's always very much in tune with its appearance on the world stage. So we're always trying to establish the root causes of this tension and this increased competition between these states. Are these mistakes that were made during a past transition, for instance, the end of the Cold War? Did we fail in terms of our strategic calculations at that time and at other historical crossroads since the end of the Cold War? And I think today we should perhaps set those root causes aside and rather turn our focus to the fact that now that we find ourselves in a more tense, uncertain environment, what should Canada do? And that's today's challenge. We want to analyze the challenges that still lie ahead.
This conference is what can Canada do now? Because Canada is a middle power. It is next to a very powerful ally that is, that has a direct stake in this great power competition, but also is experiencing some major domestic challenges, politically speaking. Alors, on est ensemble réunis pour discuter de toutes sortes
We're together
de
to
thématiques,
discuss many themes today in terms of international relations, and this revolves around our three axes, but also within the program, we've built in sufficient flexibility to have time to explore all of the points of views in the network. And you'll see that it's a wealth of knowledge that we can tap into, as well as our main speaker.
To NATO. Et aussi, nous avons le panel étudiant un peu plus tard. Pour l'instant, je vais céder la parole.
For the time being, I'll be handing the floor over to Professor Justin Massey. And I also want to thank you. It's been a great adventure to work with you. And I think that we share this enthusiasm to be together physically. So thank you. Have a great colloquium. And Justin, over to you. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm really happy to be co-directing this network with you. A few words on what we've done in terms of research. I'm very proud of the second year of this network. It was created mid-pandemic in 2020, and this year I can tell you that we have more than 39 publications that were produced by you, researchers, emerging researchers, members of the network. Thank you. It's thanks to you that this network can improve research, make it more accessible to the public at large, and obviously to governments. I'm really happy with the themes that we're looking at. We want to use academic research and make it more useful. We worked on themes such as China in the South China Sea, the impact on the area, and also the changes in international policy. This changes the type of cooperation that happens. There are major rethinks of NATO, many things that are trying to overhaul the way in which we conduct ourselves on an international level, and the network has looked at these things. Our publications are available online, and in fact, I would encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We also wanted to focus on Canada and its international cooperation efforts. We wanted to focus on modernizing the military, the difficult relationship with the US under Trump. I'm really happy with everything we've produced. The second thing we did within the network, we launched, and I'm really proud of this, one of the last military operations. On our site, we looked at all of the deployments, and they're explained per geographic area, per type, from 1990 to 2021. And we'll be carrying on so that in one single location, you'll be able to see exactly where Canada has deployed military across the planet. And it will be visually attractive as well. So I would invite you to consult our site for that. And thirdly, we also established partnerships, collaboration. The purpose of the network is to expand its partnership with international partners. And I'm really proud of one specific partnership that we're launching today, thanks to the collaboration of IRSEM in France and Ryan Evans and his organization. We really wanted to expand our partnership through a unique platform. And it's a great privilege for me today to be able to announce the creation of Rubicon. I'll let Jean-Baptiste Jean-Jean Villemer, who is the director of IRSEM, explain exactly what Rubicon is. But it's a real pleasure to have you here, Jean-Baptiste, to create this platform, to make it more accessible to the public at large. Thank you very much for being here. And over to you. Thank you very much, Justin. Welcome, everyone. I want to say that it's a great pleasure for me to be back in Canada after almost 2 years of a pandemic. I lived in Canada for a long time, and I'm still very much attached to this country. And that's why today's project is the fruit of a collaboration between France and Canada. Even though it calls on all of francophonie, it did start in Canada and France. This platform is based on our ties, that transatlantic tie, but also this language that we share. So Rubicon can be defined as a French-speaking platform that analyzes international issues, mainly security and defense issues, but also international politics and policies. Why did we want to create this platform? Well, because we wanted to meet a need, an unmet need that's twofold. Firstly, over the past few years, we've found it unfortunate that there was no French equivalent to the American site, War on the Rocks, that has this specificity of providing authors a platform that's reactive because they can publish in a few days, a quality platform because it's peer-reviewed, and also accessible because it's free. So these are the three particularities. And in French, we have journals, yes, that are peer-reviewed, but that can take months, if not years, to publish. We also have monthly publications, magazines, but that do not use peer review. And then there's the general press, where international affairs are not necessarily important. Despite that, over the past few years, we've noticed that there was a critical mass of authors and readers that were interested in the matter. So we decided that the demand was there and that we needed to create a new medium that would allow us to unite those three goals: to publish well, to publish quickly by respecting scientific standards, and also to make that accessible. Secondly, the second conclusion we came to is that each think tank already had publications, and we lacked a vehicle that would be collective and would not be reduced to the editorial views of one or the other. And it's really important because we are now seeing nationalist movements that are often violent. So it was really important to move beyond nationalism and have a platform that be international, not French or Canadian. Now, why did we call it Rubicon? Now, of course, we're talking about the river, that Caesar crossed, and at the time when he crossed the river, it was a sign of war, and that's when Caesar allegedly said that he was crossing the Rubicon for 3 reasons: to deliberately make an irreversible decision, and to also make a bet that could not be undone. So these norms are still noticed across the world. We can think of Crimea and other state actions that are often characterized by decisive actions. These are sometimes risky bets. We can think of Soleimani's assassination in Iran that could have escalated. And these policies are also irreversible, such as the current situation in China and the fact that they are unavoidable. So the fact that the Rubicon was crossed characterizes the volatility of our current relations. And these relations are becoming more and more complex and need to be better understood and analyzed in a way that's both rigorous, scientific, but useful and accessible to all, to decision makers in large numbers. And that's our ambition, the ambition of the Rubicon. So concretely, how does it work? It's an international or an internet site that you can find at rubicon.org that publishes articles that are relatively short, between 800 and 3,000 words. And this site is the initiative of 3 organizations: IRSEM, RAS, and we also bring together a team that already has about 50 experts in various committees, and you can have a look at the list on the site. And these people have begun publishing, but everybody can publish on the site. There's a page on the site that gives you all the directives or the instructions you need to submit an article. So it's accessible, but it's also scientific. So all of the articles are subject to a peer review, an anonymous peer review. So there's no guarantee it will be published. So now I'd like to ask you, whether you're online or in person, please submit your articles. We need you. This is a collaborative effort, and our success depends on your partaking in our endeavor. So if you go to the Rubicon today, you'll find 4 articles. What exactly is the Rubicon? And then Célia Bellin writes about the French-American relationships. One particularity of the Rubicon is that we publish on various topics, and we have an article from Brian Evans on the premise of the Ukraine-Russia article that was published first on War on the Rocks. It's a translation of the American site, or the article on the American site. War on the Rocks was our inspiration. Now it's a partner. Rubicon is a French cousin, if you will, of War on the Rocks, which means that beyond our original articles, occasionally we'll be translating some of the War on the Rocks articles, and sometimes War on the Rocks will also publish articles inspired from the Rubicon articles, including some of the ones that are currently published, and sometimes we'll jointly publish on both sites simultaneously. So I'm really happy to introduce you to Ryan Evans, who's the CEO of War on the Rocks and who is gracing us with his presence. Ryan.
I'm really glad you're here. I'd like to express my gratitude for your support. For years, we've been talking about this project of a French War on the Rocks. You've been extremely supportive, and now it exists. Its name is Le Rubicon, and you're with us today. So I'd like to thank you very warmly, Ryan, and I'm very glad to give you the floor. Thank you.
Hello. I think this is the first professional event I've spoken at in about 2 years, so sorry if I'm a little rusty. I took an unusual route to Ottawa. I flew into Massena, New York, and then drove across the border at Cornwall, and I can assure you that the Canadian border is secure. I was detained for about 40 minutes and interrogated. All of my bags were searched. A lot of invasive questions were asked, but very professionally, very politely. But you should feel good about this. So as Jean-Baptiste mentioned, we've been talking about this for a few years, and it's very exciting to see it come to fruition. I started War on the Rocks really as a hobby back in 2013. I was fresh back from working in Afghanistan as a Defense Department civilian, where I was deployed alongside British and Danish forces, actually, and a few French people were popping around. And I came back to DC, and I was very disappointed in the tone, tenor, and quality of debate and conversation on a whole host of defense issues. I felt like I wasn't learning as much from what I was reading online. This was at the height of the clickbait era. So a lot of once serious publications were publishing more and more, which meant they were publishing less and less of high quality. But at the same time, I was learning a lot from friends and mentors who had worked in the armed forces, the military, government, and academics doing important research as well. And I thought it would be great to recenter that experience-based conversation in the form of a publication and a podcast, which was War on the Rocks. And it took off in a way that I honestly didn't expect, to the point that it now dominates almost every waking moment of my life. And I've long believed that giving people who have what I call special knowledge, which is the knowledge they gain either by studying something in depth or doing it themselves professionally, giving those people the voice and the platform to provide real-world solutions to real-world problems of peace and war was important. It was important in improving the quality of our strategic thought, which, just speaking for the United States, I think has been abysmal for about a generation at least. And I've also felt that this could also be a vehicle for our friends and allies around the world to hopefully make contributions to their own security through publications like War on the Rocks. And this is the first one that's been started in another country, so it's very rewarding to see this. And I really want to congratulate the people responsible for taking the risk and marshaling the resources and doing all the hard work, because it is actually a lot of hard work, and it'll get even harder. So have fun with that. So I really don't have that much else to say. I guess the people that I'm looking forward to interacting with the most in the future are some of the people who I understand are going to be doing a lot of the day-to-day work on the publication. Some of the younger and more junior people, these rising and emerging scholars who are going to be running the editorial operations. And those people work behind the scenes. They'll be who you'll be dealing with if you choose to submit articles, which I hope you will. And they're absolutely critical to the success of a publication. And on that note, I'd like to thank my own team who works on this. On the War on the Rocks side, that's Shane Mason, Mary Kate Alward, and Nick Danforth. And on the Texas National Security Review side, of course, that's our publication with the University of Texas. That's Doyle Hodges and Megan Opria. You'll realize how valuable these people are every day, and they'll really determine the success, in my opinion, more than anyone else, of this publication, which I look forward to reading, not in the original French, but reading when we publish the translations, following, promoting, and supporting. And congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for these reassuring comments. That's going to get easier. But most importantly, thank you for enabling the creation of Le Rubicon. It's due to do that we can do this today, and I'm very grateful as well. Et je tiens à remercier aussi les personnes effectivement.
I also want to thank all those who have presided over the birth of Rubicon, Laurent Borcio, Adrien Estève, two postdoctoral fellows who have worked on creating Rubicon and who will be working on maintaining it. So thank you for all your work and good luck for the future. I also want to thank Myriam Saint-Normandin, who is the webmaster. I hope that you are appreciating the website, which is interesting and fun. Now, let us move to our first roundtable of this annual symposium of the Strategic Network for Strategic Analysis. And this will be presided by Sarah Myriam Martin-Brûlé, who is a professor at Bishop's University and who is also director of Axis 2 of the Network for Strategic Analysis, namely multilateral security cooperation. So I would invite Sarah Myriam and the roundtable members to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Alors, bonjour.
So Hello, my name is Sarah Myriam Martin-Brûlé. As Justin Massier was saying, I'm a professor at Bishop's University and also lead scholar of Access 2 on multilateral cooperation within the Network for Strategic Analysis, and also co-lead of the Security Council podcast, the Francophone version of the Battle Rhythm, which is co-led by Stephen Simon and Stephanie Valak. So I'm very, very happy today to lead this first roundtable on the theme of the clash of regional international organizations as part of this annual conference of the Network for Strategic Analysis on international cooperation and management of traditional and emerging threats. I'm all the happier to manage this discussion between Jean-Christophe Boucher of the University of Calgary, Daniel Jean of the Strategic Council of the Strategic Analysis Network, Stéphanie Bélanger of the Royal Military College of Canada, and Jérôme Chantal of Université de Moncton. Jean-Christophe Boucher is an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy and the Department of Political Science of the University of Calgary. Jean-Christophe is a co-lead of the Canadian Network on Information Security funded by the Ministry of National Defense. He is also research director at the Canadian Council on National Security. His research is funded by Albert Einowitz. He is a member of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a researcher for the Center for Study and Development at Dalhousie University, and lead scholar at the Inter-University Center for International Research. Daniel Jean was advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada from 2016 and 2018 in Intelligence and National Security. He was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2013 to 2016 and Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage from 2010 to 2013. From 2007 to 2010, he held a number of Deputy Minister positions as Associate Secretary to the Treasury Board and then Deputy Secretary Operations of the Privy Council Office. Prior to being Deputy Minister, he enjoyed a leading career in the field of international relations with 2 assignments in Haiti, 2 in the United States, and Buffalo and Washington, and 1 in Hong Kong. Stéphanie Bélanger is a full professor at the Department of French Language, Literature and Culture at the Royal Military College of Canada. She is Associate Scientific Director of the Canadian Institute for Research on Military and Veteran Health. She is also co-editor of the Journal of Military Veterans and Family Health at the University of Toronto. She holds the North American chapter for the study of military ethics. Jérôme Chantal is a specialist of international relations and Chinese issues. He is a professor of political science at the École de Haute Juridique at the University of Moncton. He is a former journalist and former United Nations official, and he frequently publishes articles on China and international relations in Haiti, and their detailed biography can be found on the website of the Network for Strategic Analysis. So the title of this roundtable is The Clash of Regional International Organizations. Indeed, the pandemic has created a major shift and an ironic shift. The pandemic has brought into light some flaws in international cooperation while demonstrating the need for such cooperation. It has also exacerbated vulnerabilities and suspicion between states and within states. We will address issues about what the pandemic has revealed, what it has reinforced, and what it has created. I suggest 3 themes for our discussion. First, the flaws in multilateral cooperation in the time of crisis, the challenges and opportunities for middle powers like Canada, and number 3, what are the best practices at the national, regional, and even for international institutions to face the pandemic. For each question, I will give the floor to the panelists, and then we will open the discussion to the room and to our virtual audience. So a first series of questions, and I will then yield the floor to Jean-Christophe, followed by Daniel Jean, Stéphanie Bélanger, and Jérôme Chantal. So a first series of questions for you. The pandemic has highlighted a number of flaws in multilateral cooperation in a time of crisis. According to you, which flaws have been particularly harmful And can we identify best practices at the national or international level in order to meet the next pandemic or similar crisis better? So thank you again for the invitation. I'd like to give a high-level overview of my current research, which deals with disinformation and information network related to COVID-19. What my research team has been doing since November 2020, so for a long time, too long, and we've collected essentially all the tweets written in Canada and in the world on COVID-19 and vaccination. We have about 500 million tweets in our database, and the Canadian database have about 3 million tweets. And the purpose of this exercise was first to allow us to analyze networks of influence and networks of collaboration, both Canadian and international, on information exchange related to COVID-19 that were promoting the anti-vax narrative. And what we've discovered, and the main purpose at the beginning was to say, okay, we want to measure and analyze the way anti-vax movements were organizing their message against vaccination, and who were the influencers at the international and pan-Canadian level and domestic level, and whether we could find traces, the fingerprints of Russian or Chinese influence. What we discovered, and that surprised us, was a number of things. First of all, one of the major surprises in our research was that we realized that international influence over the anti-vax movement in Canada comes mostly from the United States and Britain in English and France in French. Yes, the Chinese are active. Yes, RT.com retweets Maxime Bernier, but in reality, their influence on disinformation networks in Canada is relatively modest. And this led us to reflect. And so the way we started being able to see and trace those influences is that to a large extent, accounts and activists, especially from the US right, are promoting anti-vax themes, and some groups in Canada are acting as Trojan horses and will amplify and redirect this narrative within the discourse in Canada. So to get to the issue of cooperation between allies, this led us to reflect more on the fact that one of the key sources and one of the key flaws in collaboration between allies is this very tight integration of information networks between allies. To a large extent, what we've seen and what we're starting to understand is that the polarization and the internal dissensions within states, especially in the United States, Britain, France, have repercussions and are essentially transferred within our societies, within our internal conversations, and exacerbate those divisions to a large extent through those influence networks. We can see that American dissensions, the left-right polarization, the anti-vax movement has a direct impact on the quality of our discourse, which leads us to reflect on the place of NATO, the place of multilateral cooperation between states, and to a large extent as well, leads us to reflect about the way that we can improve the resilience of our democracies. So two things. First, democratic resilience will require bilateral and multilateral cooperation with other states. We'll never be able to secure and vaccinate, if you like, all Canadians against disinformation without close cooperation with our allies. Number two, this means having frank conversations with our allies to tell Americans that their internal divisions have a direct impact on our own networks. To an extent, the threats are less external than internal within our allied relationships, and that conversation is not taking place yet, and we're not yet having those direct contacts. Number three means that within NATO, we will have to have a much more integrated perspective, much more comprehensive perspective on internal cooperation between allies on the nature of disinformation. We want to stress to a greater extent that internal dissensions within various states has a direct impact on us, and in a way, from outside, states that wish to launch campaigns for influence can use the most divided states in order to gain influence throughout the alliance. And our weakness is multiplied by 5 because of our partnership with the United States and other states. So in terms of flaws, I think that we haven't spent enough time yet reflecting and reinforcing those capacities, being a lot more proactive at the domestic level, and to stop thinking only in terms of external threats. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for this invitation. When Justin and Stéphanie were describing the 3 groups within the networks, I'm a practitioner. As a part-time retiree, I have a lot of fun working with some researchers, but I'm very involved in the School of Public Service. And I've always really enjoy when professors invite me into their classrooms to talk to students and give them a practitioner's point of view. So that's what I will address today by trying to answer the excellent questions that Sarah has asked us. So in the first question, I would say that multilateralism was fragile before the pandemic and has been challenged, very much challenged. Let's start with the international organization that is normally responsible in the case of pandemic, the WHO. The good news, and some will be really critical about what I say, but if you compare the performance of the WHO in the context of this pandemic to its performance during the Ebola crisis in the previous decade, during the Ebola crisis, thank God we had the president of the World Bank who really took leadership at the multilateral level and brought the wealthiest states to respond. The WHO, given the size of the challenge, responded better. At the same time, during what followed, in the absence of standards and the respect of standards in a pandemic, transparency is so important. It's difficult for WHO to play its role with respect to China and the whole issue of transparency. And we probably don't have the appropriate standard setting regime in terms of the deterrence, because we can see it in the discussion with South Africa. If you do the right thing and you say that you have a new variant, you run the risk of being more heavily penalized. So when you have an infectious disease like the kind of pandemic we've got, borders are not your best approach. Closing your borders isn't your best approach if you want to resolve the pandemic. However, as we've seen during health crises, and this was amplified by the fact that we already had a populist model in many countries in polarization, but we saw very quickly the notion that me first, I'm protecting myself first, despite calls by experts and scientists to remember that the pandemic is planetary and measures must be planetary. Fortunately, common sense made a comeback. So that's the good news, and the need for a coordinated approach is more and more evident. And compared to other complicated crises like Ebola or non-health crises, we are in a society when the government really hesitates to having real discussions with the population beyond what's good for 30 or 40 character sound bites. Governments don't necessarily have the courage to have real discussions with their populations. And it's in that context that Canada did so well in vaccination, in terms of vaccination compared to other countries. Here, President Biden and others mentioned that. So I was happy to see that, because just as in our last election campaign, we don't see a lot of discussions about ideas, but their governments were responsible and were able to do that. So I also think that when variants arise, people understand that the solution is planetary. We won't have a final definitive solution until we vaccinate everybody. And if there's been a lack of collaboration in terms of the worldwide response at the beginning. It's improved now. In the race to vaccines, there was very good collaboration with results that were very, very quick and effective. And in addition, results that will have consequences for other major illnesses, such as malaria, if the scientists, according to the scientists. So something very positive. Now, we were asked to talk about the clash of international, regional organizations. Talked about the regional level. Maybe experts take a dwell on that less, but as a practitioner, I've worked on that. So the progress in developing North American strategies, common protocols, trilateral. This is one area that has the most maturity in the trilateral Canada, United States, Mexico agenda. That unfortunately suffered because of political leadership who were in place at the time of the crisis. And that's where we'll contrast H1N1. At the beginning of H1N1, people were dying. Pregnant women were dying, and young Indigenous people were dying, and we didn't know why. It was like at the beginning of the current pandemic. So I don't want to say that it's a pandemic that was as major as this one, but it could have been dangerous. We didn't know what it was. And what was amazing at that time was that the trilateral track between Canada, Mexico, and the United States was so strong that there was a lot of work done right out saying we'll put in capacity, help Mexico, and that was where the trilateral protocols began and the meetings of the three amigos, and that led to other progress, such as smallpox vigilance. Measles vigilance. So I was writing a Canadian contribution to Wilson's book about North American cooperation, and the most mature example was the cooperation in health, on health issues between the three countries. So we've had setbacks. I hope that these setbacks with the political changes in the United States can be reversed, and that we can continue along the path to greater maturity. So at the national level, there were misses, but we also learned lessons. The response, the very energetic and efficient and effective response in Indigenous communities in Canada, and also lessons learned from areas where we had significant misses. But that's the good news. But about the long-term care populations that were hardest hit in Canada, there were protocols. There was a very clear one in Quebec. If there were pandemic, major health measures had to be taken in long-term care homes. But the obsession with the fact that our hospitals were running the risk of overcapacity, that we didn't implement the kind of execution we could have done given the lessons of the past. All this to say that those lessons learned exercises are extremely important. And that's where we have to draw lessons about how to work at the multilateral level, how we can create incentives and deterrents so that countries can work together in a worldwide crisis to bring about a worldwide response. And it was interesting because I was saying I was writing the Canadian contribution. I was also writing up case studies for the programs that we do at the School of the Public Service. And I happened to read the Harvard case study on Katrina. And I could have changed Katrina to COVID-19 because what was Katrina? Low likelihood, high impact, very high impact for years and years because we had a scare. We had a mid-sized hurricane that we get ready, and then we realized that we're getting ready for something that may not happen, and then we pay less attention. If you look at that, if you look at H1N1 and now COVID-19, there's a lot of similar lessons to be learned. Thank you. Hello, I'm extremely happy to be with you this morning. There are a number of points that were mentioned that I won't dwell on. I will focus on at maybe a theoretical level that relates to the flaws in managing the response to the COVID crisis in 2019. At the theoretical level, the biggest flaw was at the conceptual level. In other words, right now, what is the place of non-conventional challenges in strategic thinking? I will give you just one example, which monopolized the strategic debate just prior to the onset of the pandemic, a debate that was launched by one book, Thucydides' Trap. And at that time, we could have the impression that we were being faced with an imminent war between major powers, between the United States and China. And at that very moment, the United States, under the Trump presidency, were building a wall at the border between the United States and Mexico. In parallel, the United States were significantly reinforcing their military budget and their defense budget. And the book I was referring to was Destined for War by Graham Allison. So the virus ignored national borders and ravaged the United States, in particular, the United States, which as the leading world power, were clearly not well prepared to respond to this crisis. So I would like to return to that statement, to that hypothesis I've advanced about non-conventional hypothesis. We can talk about climate change, which is one, in my opinion, the way we manage the COVID-19 crisis has to be a test of our ability to cooperate on other non-conventional challenges. So there is that that flaw at the conceptual level, which requires a cognitive response at the strategic level in terms of what they will focus on. So going back to Destined for War, an excellent article by Kenneth Walls in Foreign Policy reminds that at the same time as the Peloponnesian War that inspires the historian, that is considered a foundational text of realpolitik, there was a pandemic that was like COVID-19 and that had decimated the population of ancient Greece and that had caused the death of major leaders like Pericles. So instead of having a war between China and the United States, we had a pandemic that brought the world economy to its knees and that the world was not prepared for responding. So in my opinion, and that is why it's important to have a network like the Network for Strategic Analysis and information sites like Rubicon, to put greater stress on the fact that rather than building physical borders, it would be appropriate to enhance the capacity of multilateral organizations that are better placed to help managing the response to this crisis. So there is, of course, this flaw that I am pointing out at the conceptual level that shows the need for a cognitive change, both at the strategic level. And the final, the last flaw I'd like to point out is related to the new world configuration that we have today. You will remember the major crisis, the major economic crisis of the 1930s up to 1939. Ken Heidelberger theorized it as the absence of a hegemon. COVID-19 occurred in the absence of a hegemon because the United States were, under Donald Trump, were withdrawing, and China had not yet taken its place, because the flaw started in China with information retention. And once the WHO was able to alert the world about the scope of the pandemic, then we wasted precious time in mutual recrimination, in talking about the China virus, rather than working together to give a concerted response. So we are therefore in this new strategic context, characterized that by what I conceive as the emergence of a multipolar world. So we are in a multipolar context with the presence on the international stage of an exceptionally high number of large powers or major poles of power, Europe, Japan, and so on. But within this multipolar world, we have a bipolarity. The United States that are continuing to lead a liberal world order, and on the other hand, on the other side, China, which seeks to position itself at the head of an illiberal world order. And that is bad news for international cooperation, unless we can get to mutual understanding of the importance of collaboration between the major world powers on non-conventional challenges. We can expect that a new crisis can be managed practically in the same way as what we have seen in the case of COVID-19. And in my opinion, those are the major flaws that we can note in the management of this crisis.
So I'd like to bring you back to something maybe not as far in time as Thucydides, but further in time than the current time, April 1st. April 1st, 2020. If you'll cast your mind back to that period, it was an important period of time where we found ourselves with a large problem in Canada in long-term healthcare facilities. That was in Quebec and in Ontario as well. So Canada knew that it had too little staff to look after seniors, and that in both provinces, Quebec and Ontario, there were dramatic problems. And that's why both provinces turned to the armed forces. I don't know if you are aware, but within CAF, there are healthcare professionals, and so we turned to them to help with the crisis in long-term care facilities. So the Canadian Armed Forces were deployed. I'll be speaking about the first wave of the pandemic, the one that began in April 2020, and the response of CAF at the time. It started, I said April 1st, it was rather March 1st until August 31st. To give you an idea, at the time when CAF was deployed in long-term care facilities in Quebec, when they entered in Canada, there were 21,000 and some residents who were infected, and 1/3 died of COVID. Same goes for the staff. The proportion is more or less the same. So we found ourselves in a significant staff shortage. There wasn't enough staff, not only because people didn't want to go to work because it was dangerous, but also because staff were falling ill. So it was a significant crisis, and we decided to deploy the armed forces. The physician-in-chief at CAF communicated with DRDC. I apologize. I know there's a French acronym for that, but DRDC. And what did they do? They said it could be very stressful. The Canadian Armed Forces are trained for stressful times, yes, but not necessarily for seeing seniors die before their eyes in dramatic decline. So these were people that could have been their parents and grandparents, and that was something that was very different from what they had been trained for. So we wanted to understand the risk factors and protective factors as well, to try and make our forces more resilient, and to figure out if in fact it was a good idea to deploy forces that were trained for disasters, but not that type of demographic. So with that deployment, there were 3 chains of command. And this is a dramatic difference with the Ebola crisis, where there was one single hierarchical chain of command that was much more hierarchical, so top down, all the way down to the ground. Whereas in this case, we found ourselves in a domestic deployment. It wasn't the first time that we looked after infections, but it was the first time that we looked after an outbreak in Canada. And we found ourselves under 3 chains of command, those that were in charge of, pardon me, I'm losing my mask. So those that were in charge of the armed forces that looked mainly at soldiers that had been deployed for cleaning. So we're talking about a lot of reserve staff. In the other chain of command, there was an armed forces from the regular force that were deployed. Now, the big problem was that in Quebec, they had to be bilingual, not only qualified, but also bilingual. They had to at least get by in French. And that was a big problem because we were deploying people that came from British Columbia all the way to the Maritimes. And so some did not speak French well enough to be able to make a judgment call on each case. So there were a lot of shortcomings. Not only did Canada not have a way to control the situation in long-term care facilities, but we were deploying armed forces that had many crises that they were not used to being faced with. So it became extremely complicated. The stress factors were looked at were overall stress factors for any deployment, whether it's in a pandemic or not, whether it's in Canada or abroad. So when somebody has already experienced trauma before the deployment, if they've already been experienced trauma, whether they have a physical or a mental ailment, whether they have poor training for this role, or whether they are too trained for the role, or whether that person doesn't have significant support, social supports, that person may have many risk factors. And these risk factors are often things like depression, anxiety, no, not factors, risk factor, but rather the result of those risk factors can lead to anxiety and depression. And there are also protective factors. So we had to study that. And we were trying to see what sort of moral harm there could be. Because in this case, PTSD is not necessarily something that's quite obvious. There's not one specific event that causes PTSD. Rather, it's repetitive strain that causes the moral harm. For instance, poor sanitary conditions, poor ventilation, despair. So it became very stressful for our armed forces. And we sent 2,500 questionnaires. We did hundreds of interviews. It was fantastic to hear the armed forces talk about their experience. Most of them had a positive experience in the sense that they didn't have any lasting effects on their mental health. And to give you an idea of who was deployed, about half the forces were from the regular forces, the other half from the reserve forces, and about 70% were male versus female, which can be astonishing because healthcare is generally female dominated. However, many people were deployed for cleaning floors and for other less skill intensive tasks. So about 35% of people were in clinical care and about 35% were in support roles. And so I could speak at length about everything they experienced, all the trauma they experienced, but I think at the end of the day, the communication problem was extremely significant, more significant than in an international deployment. That's what everybody said amongst those people that were deployed in the past internationally, to a degree that people said they were listening to the news to see what was happening rather than the chain of command. And that's quite in stark contrast to what we're used to seeing. The food would come to hotels rotten. Some people would say that their food was crawling. Why? Because nobody was ready for the pandemic. There was no supply chain. So communications, hygiene problems. So there were many things at play. And some people were abusing seniors, which was shocking, but there were also very touching moments where they were in the Greek part of Montreal, where some of the locals produced a quick reference dictionary for them to understand Greek. So many things were done to help with the pandemic, to try and make up for those shortcomings, but it was made in quite a disorganized fashion. And everybody would tell you, we could tell you that we all knew the pandemic was coming. People were starting to isolate at home long before March 1st. And in terms of the situation on the ground, there didn't seem to be any preparation. Thank you. So we'll be moving from shortcomings to challenges and opportunities. So as a second series of questions, I'd like you to tell us more about these challenges and these opportunities that countries like Canada will have to manage in the years to come, knowing that the pandemic has brought to light a lot of our shortcomings. I think that we can think about those challenges both domestically. So what could Canada do in order to reform and bolster its resilience in terms of information, but also what we can do on an international scale? Three things domestically that the pandemic and our lack of capacity to manage information on COVID-19 has revealed. Firstly, hesitancy of civilian authorities to invest in IT. Even there's a lot of hesitancy to even have conversations about COVID-19. For instance, one of the things we see often is that one of the reasons people aren't getting vaccinated mainly has to do with their perception of freedom. It's not really that they're anti-vax, it's more that they have distrust towards civilian authorities. So there is a significant gap, and there's a lack of willingness from Canadian authorities to find ways to strengthen the trust of the people in the government. Now, obviously, sexual abuse does not help, and those problems that we've seen in the armed forces will not help. Now, in terms of communication, nobody knows currently who has the capacity to invest in information. We have units in Heritage Canada, in National Defense, in PHAC, all over the place, and people have been developing their capacity in silo. There's very little cross-sectional capacity, and some things are done in public safety, and there's a bit of confusion with respect to responsibilities and capabilities. And on one level, there's also a lack of political will to develop a sandbox, a clear policy on who should work on what and how it should be done. In one way, recent problems in CAF in terms of information happened because of a lack of civil direction to tell the military, this is what we expect from you, and this is what your sandbox is. This is the legal framework under which you can operate. We don't have that in Canada, and it's a crying shame. Thirdly, lack of capacity in a political communication. It's very traditional still in Canada. It's still old school. We still have, or we had conversation with people who told us, we'll post stuff in magazines to tell people to get vaccinated. And I said, well, I don't know exactly who still buys magazines, but obviously there's a lack of understanding of how to identify and target an audience, those people that are vaccine hesitant. There's still a very old school understanding of the way in which we can reach those people, such as ads in magazines. So that's a major problem. Moreover, there's not a lot of capacity in terms of artificial intelligence, of network knowledge, network learning. A lot of large corporations have that capacity. They can sell you a new pair of Nike, the exact color you wanted at the time you want them, but the government of Canada isn't capable of doing that sort of thing, and that's a major problem. On an international scene, 4 things. Firstly, most social media platforms are American. This creates a problem to try and manage these platforms, and Canada is absent on that scene and doesn't have a lot of levers to make sure that those platforms have ethical standards. And as a corollary, each state has its own standards in terms of freedom of expression. Some states are far more liberal than Canada. I was thinking more specifically of the US, and this interaction of our American and Canadian standards create a lot of friction in the sense that Americans are affecting us. Now, given that the platforms are American, there's also a willingness of the American government to put pressure on states to limit and regulate the reach of social media, and Canada has not been heeding this advice. Thirdly, I think we should shame some of our allies in the sense that people tend to say, I'm really concerned with the misinformation coming from the US and they should look after us, rather than look at their own willingness to do something. And I think this exacerbates and limits our ability to invest in that area. And finally, Canada can develop international norms and cooperate with other states that have similar challenges. Some states and groups of states, such as the EU and Australia, are trying to regulate the platforms, are trying to have international standards on those issues, and Canada could get involved and develop similar strategies. For instance, Canada could align itself with the privacy and security regulations in Europe. That's not done, and currently our legal framework is loose and outdated and inadequate. So there's a lot of work to do domestically and internationally on that front. Thank you. Thank you. I'll start by a bit of a contrarian view with respect to the number of things that have been underscored by COVID. I think that we're blaming COVID for a lot of things. I think we need to look at the environment before COVID. Globalization had already been staggering for a while, and wealth inequality was more and more polarized, especially in the US. In that context, within that backdrop, towards the end of the Obama administration, and I think this is something that is tied to the rise of China, think about the alternatives that they were trying to find in Asia, alternatives to China. Look at international institutions before the pandemic. The WTO, the UN, there were major setbacks in terms of the nuclear file, etc. And China and the US were waging almost a technological war in order to take control of not only the military sphere, but also technological.
Economically dominant, so it can actually impose other things, and we see that it can work. But when you look at what they're trying to achieve, the US, Biden has a very aggressive economic agenda to try to bring back redistribution of wealth so he can mitigate the polarization. And in the case of China, in a totally different regime and not the same values for sure, but they're just trying to see as they move up on the supply chain whether or not they can continue to redistribute wealth, because otherwise they may have difficulties, right? This whole grow old before you grow rich column. So it feeds the strong protectionism that we see from the US, and we feel it as their key neighbor and our key market, Canada. Bon, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire pour nous? Je pense que pour des pays comme le Canada, mais c'est vrai également for
countries like Canada, but also for the EU and many non-member states of the EU. We are understanding that we're vulnerable. Many of these countries have realized that they are very vulnerable to the pursuit of a bilateral conversation with China. They had this ambition to have a privileged relationship with China, and we can see that they've done a whole 180-degree in terms of their position towards China. By the same token, the other actor, even though it's benevolent, even though it's more in a rule of law constraint, even though it's closer to our values, it doesn't hesitate to intimidate as well. So how can a country like us, how can a country or an area like Europe try to intervene where we need to protect our national interests? We have to understand that we have close ties with the US economically, and from a security standpoint, how do we not create more interdependency? So we need to create allies amongst ourselves. And I'll use an example. During the Trump administration, the Ottawa Group for Trade tried to find likely-minded states to make sure that if the WTO was blocked, we try and find sufficient critical mass in order to move files forward. And it's that type of creativity, it's that type of alliance that we'll need to create amongst ourselves, other countries, because yes, the US are important to us. Yes, we like them. They're a neighbor, a partner, but they have their own interests and they don't necessarily align with ours. Now, with respect to disinformation, misinformation, and social media, I would say that in terms of the root causes, if you have a public that enjoys this type of conspiracy theories, such as south of the border, now education being lacking, education is a great equalizer. If you look at data within Canada, the American dream really happens in Canada. If you live in Canada and you come from a very modest family, you would have a better chance of success given our education system. And I think that our work on daycare, if you read what Pierre Fortin says with respect to women's participation in the workforce, all of these things will help the situation in Canada. So all this to say that if you look at inequality, if you work on inequality, it's a lot easier to fight misinformation that you find on social media, as my colleague was saying earlier. So in my opinion, yes, the pandemic has exacerbated one thing, and that's inequality. And I think that that's where we need to focus our attention. With the other aspects, a lot of these factors, to my mind, existed before the pandemic. What the pandemic should show is that non-conventional crises like climate change and a pandemic require an integrated planet-wide approach. We need to set aside our differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would propose that we should think about the various challenges in terms of the need, again, for a cognitive advance. I think a cognitive stretch. I think the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the limits of the Western model, of the liberal model, as it has been practiced since the 80s, especially with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the United States. That model, which consisted essentially in saying the state is the problem, the state was not the solution. I believe that there is an ideological rigidity that has a paralyzing effect in the West, namely the inability to draw lessons from the crises that we've experienced and to make appropriate adjustments, because all of those conventional challenges are bred by globalization, whether it's climate change, COVID-19. Their spread is also part and parcel of globalization. So how can we explain the inability, the unpreparedness of powers such as France, such as the European Union, such as the United States, or Spain, Italy, that are major countries that were brought to their knees because since the 80s, the government was seen as the problem and not the solution. the state had to be taken out of the economy. The invisible hand would take care of it. And therefore, the economic and financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and then when COVID arrived, the United States used plastic bags, garbage bags for PPE for nurses, and there was a lack of preparedness. And the US president was heavily invested in enhancing, restoring US military capacities, whereas even US military analysts feel that there is not merely a gap, but a chasm between US military capacities and the next competing powers. So middle powers, including Canada, fared better overall compared to the United States. But although we can draw some consolation from the comparison, in light of those various crises, it will have been shown that the invisible hand of the market is not sufficient, but that the hand of government should be more and more visible. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, was referring to the left hand of the government and the right hand of the government, and those two hands are equally important. So COVID-19, in that sense, will also have been a use case, a test of those various models. When we talk about China and the West, especially in Canada, since the Meng Wanzhou case and the Sinophobia, the negative perception of China. When we talk about China and we talk about it calmly and we're not rude about it, we can easily be suspected of being a stooge for the Chinese Communist Party. It's not my case. I have to speak according to my conscience. China was guilty originally of withholding information at the regional level, at the central level. We can talk about that, but nonetheless, China did show its ability to implement a response and to manage the pandemic in a way that was overall much more competent than what was done in most Western countries. And I think that the explanation is also the strength of the Chinese state compared to the weakening of other Western governments. So to conclude quickly about Canada, I believe that this issue is extremely important, and indeed think tanks and networks for analysis can feed our reflection process. And I share with most of what has been said about Canada's path. The evolution of Canadian foreign policy. I work in international relations. It's of interest to me, but I'm not a specialist of Canada's foreign policy. But the recent path followed by Canada's foreign policy is a paradox. Generally speaking, Canada has been following along with Lester B. Pearson's principle, the former Prime Minister, who urged Canadians to find a middle path on the international scene and to avoid choosing between the major powers that are vying for international supremacy. The current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is very much in this continuity when he says Canada's back, and he has published a number of op-eds in Canada's newspapers when Chinese investments were seen as being security issues. China had exerted a very substantial influence in order to get Chinese companies accepted in Canada while Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. The possibility for the bait being dangled was the possibility for Canada to sign a free trade agreement with China, but that the relationship has deteriorated substantially. And yesterday, Prime Minister Trudeau has announced Canada's decision to boycott diplomatically the Beijing Olympic Games. So I think that Canada is taking a dangerous path that will bring about complications on the international scene. Canada enjoys, or rather Canada has difficult relationships with all emergent powers right now, Russia, India, China. And what Canada will have learned during the pandemic crisis is that it is imprudent to ground its foreign policy on a single relationship, on a relationship with a single power. The United States, you're quite right, reacted by putting America first when it came to apparently masks ordered by Canada were apparently diverted. So to conclude, in the emerging international order with which is three-dimensional, a multipolar dimension, and then a polarization, since China and the United States will quite likely continue to be rivals. Canada would be much better, would do much better to return to its former policy, which was based on mobilizing what you call the like-minded democracies in Europe in order to create a new pole, to refer to the Conference of Non-Aligned Countries in Indonesia in the 1950s, when the various countries said, well, okay, there's an ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. We want to have an independent approach. We want to cooperate, and Canada could have played an essential role on non-conventional issues such as climate change, which could be discussed and brought forward as part of that multipolar world order, while China and the United States continue, as they are likely to do, continue struggling over the next years. And that is, it's in that sense that I believe that Canada's current foreign policy is not going in the right direction, if I may say so. I'm sorry if I was a little over long.
I don't know if you knew, but something that I just learned from a paper that was published by Robert Elgin. During First World War, we all know there was the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, and many soldiers died during the war because of it, not only because of war casualties. But I think was 1st Canadian Division. I can't remember which division. I think was the first, but it doesn't really matter. Or it does matter because it shows, when you look at my poor memory, imagine the country's memory. But what happened is that division had the highest rate of survival across all the allies from the First World War, and they were the most functional. They did not lose their operational capability, which is quite amazing. This being said, now we are in a pandemic, and first deployment, there was no clothing, no food available, nothing. Everything they did would put at risk the lives of their military. So when we talk about lessons learned, sometimes we wonder, what are we learning from other missions? Or I was talking about the Ebola and how, why is it that we don't always treat our domestic operation the same way that we treat the international operations, with the same strong structure? Within Operation Laser, that operation where we deployed forces in long-term care facilities, there was there was a lot of differences among the two provinces, Ontario and Quebec, in terms of chain of command. And the Quebec one was the closest to an international deployment. They took the exact same orders as in Afghanistan and translated them to that DOMOP. The other thing, as a lesson learned that the pandemic gave us, is through the human factor. There's the politics, there's the tensions, there's the LIFI, broken system, but the human factor in what we saw, in what we lived, in what we're still living, and we're about to continue living, apparently, is absolutely, I think, the most powerful tool we have. And this is where we should focus, I believe, truly in what the capacity of the people, whether people in uniform or the civilians, the way that they deployed all their heart into that mission is absolutely illuminating and inspiring. So that's all I wanted to say, to focus on lessons learned.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, je vous propose de se tourner.
Thank you very much. Now, I would suggest that we look to the future. And in this third series of questions, I would ask you which country, region, or international organization is best equipped for the post-pandemic transition or to manage the continuing pandemic in the longer term. Very quickly, informationally, Europe, probably. They've been working for a long time on developing standards and a legal framework that would help manage that crisis. They are at the forefront of this question. Australia, they are also very active. And in Asia, Taiwan has, surprisingly, years of experience countering Chinese disinformation, and therefore has developed mechanisms that are very interesting. The least well-adapted countries, the United States, naturally, and here, this is really the flaw in the system, in the informational system, given their internal dissensions and also their weight, their size. Very quickly, I have to come back to one thing. And that is really closely related to our RMC colleague. The pre-crisis difficulties, we experienced this situation we did in our health system, in our long-term care, because of the existing flaws in the system. So when we talk about a crisis, let's reinforce capacity in long-term care homes, hospital systems, because the second thing is partnerships. The Red Cross, for the kind of mission that we gave the military, the Red Cross would be better placed to do it. They already do it at the international level. They are in Canada, but there were no existing partnerships in Canada because the military can make a difference. They did make a difference during the pandemic. Logistics, transportation, that's their expertise. The pandemic, climate change, and you really said it very well earlier, those are challenges where we have to be able to put aside our differences. China, the United States. I was slightly encouraged, quote unquote, by the fact that in the context of the last COP, the United States and China were able to talk and to, give an example of ambition for the various countries. That's very, very important. We have to develop the same kind of awareness for future pandemics. Think for a minute. SARS was less contagious and more severe. COVID-19 was much more contagious than SARS, but less severe. So the more vulnerable were affected. But if we had both the degree of contagiousness and the degree of severity, it would be a catastrophe. So we have to be prepared. We have to adopt both normative framework to make sure that the me first doesn't become the norm, as well as deterrence. What Canada did with the United States on ventilators was brilliant to show that the supply chains were so integrated that if we didn't get access to their ventilators, we would stop export of ventilator components made in Canada. We have to demonstrate that before the crisis. We have to show that it's in people's interest to do that. Also, as I was saying earlier, in terms of norms to deter the lack of transparency as we had at the beginning. We must say that China has done a lot more, was a lot more transparent on this than about SARS. And at the same time, I think that countries have to protect themselves in some sectors that are very, very sensitive, supplies. You have to have reserves, you have to have local capacities and so on. That's the kind of question we have to ask. Now, just going back to, and I think the biggest puzzle as we exit the pandemic is inequalities. Countries have to work both domestically to reduce inequalities, to reduce polarization, to make sure that there's more social cohesion, and I think the same applies internationally. Very quickly, the good news is that, and this conference has shown it, yes, there were a lot of difficulties in terms of cooperation between major powers especially, but there are nonetheless mechanisms in place that we can build on. I'm thinking in particular of the World Vaccine Alliance. There's also CEPI, the Coalition for Innovation in Pandemic Preparations. There's, of course, the World Health Organization, which has done significant work, even though at the beginning, at the outset, according to the information we have, WHO failed to alert the world to the problem in China. And finally, we now have the access to COVID-19 tools mechanism, of which COVAX is a part. COVAX is an initiative that aims at no less than vaccinating the entire world. And that's important because we have seen gaping disparities in the response in terms of the vaccine strategy worldwide. And that shows that in terms of attitudes, we have to change. Why? What would be the use of vaccinating all Canadians if other countries with which Canada is in contact are not vaccinated? So, according to the Financial Times, at the beginning of the year, there were 178 million of vaccine doses being distributed. Listen, 30% in the United States, 23% in China, 12% within the European Union, 9% in the United Kingdom. Just to take India with 1,100,000,000 people, only half of what was distributed in the United Kingdom. So you can see that for the rest of the world, the developing world, there were countries, developing countries, that had still not received any, had still not administered a single dose of vaccine. So this is ridiculous, because even New Zealand, that managed to protect itself, would not be safe in a world in which it is in contact with other countries where not everyone is vaccinated. And to conclude, therefore, even with the excellent multilateral infrastructures that exist today, of which I just mentioned a few, all this would not be any use if at the level of the major powers, because as you know, in the international context, we are in what we often describe as an anarchic context. There is no one government able to enforce the rule of law. So in despite of their differences, major powers would need to arrive at a modus operandi to cooperate on the key issues. Otherwise, take the case of the WTO, which has been much criticized. But to me, the most important question is, why? Why was sorry, not WHO. Why was it not able to alert about it? Because apparently of Chinese interests. So if it's not WHO that we need to criticize, because the United States could have, they do this with the World Bank, Europe does it with the IMF. So in this context, states tend to focus on their own national interests. That has always been the case, but faced with issues that threaten everyone's health, everyone's interests, in spite of divergences, it would be well if the major powers were to reach a new form of a concert of the major powers, as was the case in Europe, not to paper over the differences, but to cooperate when necessary. Otherwise, I think that even with the best international institutions, we won't manage to do this, since states, international institutions are only as good as what the states make of them. Very quickly, because I agree with what has been said, the question was, which country is the best equipped to participate? Well, each country has strengths and weaknesses. Canada is well positioned in terms of vaccines, vaccination rates.
To people who are online as well to engage with the panelists and to ask your questions. Yes, Justin Massy.
Merci beaucoup à tous pour l'excellente table ronde.
Thank you very much for this excellent roundtable. So, two questions. The first one for Jean-Christophe. Yes, Europe, Taiwan, Australia, more advanced countries, but what are the best practices? How do you counter disinformation? 2 or 3 key elements. How do we do it? How do we go about it? I'd be very curious. And the second question for Stéphanie. When the Canadian forces were brought in, there was a lot of hesitation. There was hesitation having, the army in long-term care homes. It wasn't as harmonious. There was a promise of having 24,000 soldiers available. We had trouble sending in a few hundred. Are we really ready for the next time, given that the military is called upon to deploy to deal with floods, pandemics? Are the Canadian forces ready to deal with domestic issues?
So, all right, I have to do this. All right, I'll do it in English. It's going to be faster and easier for me. Good question. Like, how do you fight misinformation and disinformation in a society? And if we knew about this, then we would probably be better at it. I'm thinking of 3 things. The first one is the notion that misinformation and disinformation really depends on the kind of country you're in. And in many ways, what we know about misinformation is that it always tags along the divisions and the particularities of a country. And so we have to think of national ways to think about how to fight misinformation. Other countries are doing it, but Canada, in a multicultural, multilingual, multinational environment, has to think in terms of what it is for us to promote trust in institutions and what it is for us to increase democratic resiliency. So that's the first part. The second part, I'd say, transparency. The worst thing ever with misinformation is when governments and other organizations are hiding behind, risk-averse communication strategies, and that creates a capacity and essentially a black hole of information that is filled by conspiracy theorists and by, other kinds of information. In some ways, when we look at pre-COVID-19, on vaccine hesitancy, no one was actually doing anything to fight vaccine hesitancy except certain kinds of organizations in the world, like the WHO and other kinds of more kind of private enterprise and think tanks. In many ways, neither pharmaceutical companies nor governments were actually doing anything. So we left essentially the field completely open to the anti-vaxxers to create narrative, create collaborations, create networks, and that went really well. until COVID-19 came, and then suddenly we were surprised that we couldn't actually invest in that space in the way that we thought we should. I know now, so pharmaceutical companies right now, Merck, GSK, are trying to build capacities on vaccine hesitancy. They know and now understand that they can't let the narrative be built by other people, and they have to be in that space. Same thing for Government of Canada. There has to be a capacity to think clearly and fast and reactively in terms of social media communication. You don't need 35 or 34, I don't know how much that is now, authorizations to tweet. And in some ways, we're still very behind and very risk averse in communicating. So this is, that's the second part. And transparency also means that in some ways, there like more information and more genuine conversations with the national debate is important. And the more you let the public, in the dark, the less they will understand. The more they will fill with other kinds of things they do. And the last part, I think, regulations of platforms. In some ways, we have to come to terms with the notion now that social media platforms are great to create all sorts of externalities and connections amongst us, but also that they present a real and present danger in our social democracies. And in some ways, they have some sort of responsibility toward that. What does that mean? I don't know, but it certainly means that we have to invest more time and more capacity to actually see what they're doing. I can scrape Twitter, and actually I'm doing it right now. So if you're tweeting COVID vaccine, right now I'm catching your tweets. And we're scraping Reddit also. But that capacity to access the API gives us a lot of freedom to see what the algorithms are doing, what they're like, the impact of those. I have no capacity to do this for Facebook. Facebook is completely closed to everyone. And in some respects, Facebook's attitude now is that we'll tell you if it works and we'll deal with this and trust us. I think now we know that we can't trust them as far as I can throw them, and it's a multi-billion company, so I don't think I can throw them that far. And here I think governments and agencies need to push back and say, we want to see your code. We want to be able to see this. Yes, there are trade secrets, and yes, they're IP, but the government should have a capacity to actually understand what you're doing and the impact it is. And also hold into account those companies that are, polluting our airspace. We have to start to think about platforms as the same way we think about oil and gas industries and everything. We have to tax carbon. We have to, understand the full scale of their impacts on society. And that means also pushing the Americans around, because the Americans don't want this, and they're going to lobby really hard for Canada to do as least as possible. And that's an issue that the Prime Minister and everyone has to get behind and say, well, we don't care. And if Facebook wants to get out of Canada, do, and that's going to start to unravel super fast. I think that would help.
Professeur Bélanger, si vous vouliez.
Oui, donc j'ai déclaré tantôt si j'avais ou non des...
So earlier I was asked to declare if I had COVID symptoms, but not conflict of interest. So I'm a reservist. So I don't know if that means that I'm fully independent, but I'm speaking here as a researcher. Are the armed forces ready for other deployments? How shall I say? In the case of this pandemic, on March 1st, 2020, the problem we had was mainly a bilingual issue. We know that CAF deploys a lot of resources towards bilingualism, but does someone have the ability to analyze a patient chart clinically in a bilingual fashion? That wasn't the case. We didn't have that sort of resources. So that's something we have to work on. We're aware of the issue, and we're hoping that we'll be able to find a fix in recruiting, training, etc. However, in terms of deployment capacity, the Canadian Armed Forces can do a lot with very little. Anything to add? No, I think that was complete. Great. I would just say that there's a fundamental issue with the entire system in Canada in case of emergency. The conceptual framework is an insurance framework. If you want to be as well equipped as possible, everybody needs to share in the burden. If there's no deductible, for instance, you'll not ensure that you don't have the next problem. So when you have a faulty framework, what it means is that there's no protocol in place that's established to say who is best positioned to respond when there's an emergency. And very often in practice, a letter is sent to the minister. And in practice, what I've seen in many disasters, the federal government says, you know, you could ask for this or that. But in an emergency response planning system, things should already be established. We should say for this scenario, this is the capacity we'll be deploying, which means that CAF is not always the best in terms of logistics. You know, they're great in transport, but it's probably not the best response unit. We could see that, for instance, the Red Cross was much more agile when it had to provide this expertise abroad. I talked about the analysis I do on a North American basis. The Red Cross developed a protocol really quickly between 3 countries that was much more sophisticated than what we did on a government scale between 3 countries. So between the municipal, provincial, and federal governments, there has to be a framework. We have to understand what level of government has what capacity and what should be deployed in case of which scenario. Moving on to a question online. It comes from Beijing, and the question is, the capacity of states to agree on fighting a common enemy, COVID-19, was that a way to now unveil threats before they
When
appear?
the Liberals did the Strong, Secure, and Engage consultations, I was part of the Calgary crew that met them. At that time, during that meeting, we told the panel that we thought they should think about, you know, emerging threat, especially pandemics. And the general that was part of the board laughed. That's it. That's my point. That's it. Like, we told them, and okay, they decided that there was other priorities. That meant that we weren't ready. The forces. Have we received the bio isolation chambers for the C-17 now? I know we wanted to buy them to fly around to go to the north. I don't think we have them yet. I think we have, like, you know, isolation chambers for like people, but not yet the full one. And that was something that was supposed to be done before. So we weren't ready, and the forces weren't structured in a way to think about how those pandemics might affect their operations on the ground.
Ni hao, Gilles. À Pékin, mais je pense que oui, tout à fait.
I think you're right to ask the question. I think it's a harbinger of poor cooperation in the future, because it's not just what we've seen around COVID-19, but since then, there's been an entire movement, homegrown in the US, that is trying to engage networks to fight China. Think of the Five Eyes or AUKUS that were created. But I think that the good news within this is that under Biden's presidency, it's been said more and time and again that the US wants to continue to cooperate on China on issues where American interests are at stake. And we think that we can hope that the US will continue to cooperate on essential issues such as non-conventional threats, and in fact, to close the loop on that, perhaps you'll tell me that I focus too much on Canada, but I think that Canada has an extremely important role to play through the G20. G20 is a creation of Canada. Paul Martin at the time played a pivotal role in creating the G20. So that multilateral forum can help deal with non-conventional threats. In fact, since the 2008 financial crisis, the G20 has emerged as the multilateral forum that is the main structure to handle the balancing that has to be found amongst these various states. So in answer, yes, it can be worrisome, but if countries like Canada play a role, you know, to balance things out, things could improve. Do you have anything to add? I would just say that non-conventional threats that are worldwide command approaches that can survive their creators. And it's unfortunate that on an international scale, as well as a regional scale, because on the regional scale, we had great protocols, but pandemics happen every 30 years on average. And I remember interviewing somebody from PHAC just before the pandemic, when they told me it should be in 5 to 10 years. There was SARS about 20 years ago. Will we be ready for the next pandemic? We need systemic approaches. We need to ensure that they can survive their authors, their creators, and there's a lesson to draw from that. The Americans have withdrawn from international institutions, and last year they realized that they had 4 to 5 international organizations surrounding them that were headed by Chinese diplomats. It's good for China to get involved if it's in line with democratic values, but the way the Chinese see themselves in their diplomatic roles is very different from the way diplomacy is expressed in Canada and the US. So I think that if we want a better international response, we need to have normative processes that outlast their creators. One last question then, perhaps from the floor, to alternate between our virtual audience and our audience in the room. I think there's somebody in the room. Go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you very much for this really interesting session. I'm from Foreign Affairs Canada, Chief of Staff for the Ambassador. So the panelists talked to the fact that the pandemic has exacerbated international inequalities and has also drawn international attention with respect to the disproportionate impact of some crises, including the pandemic, on women. And with respect to the role of Canada and our competitive advantage, we have a feminist foreign policy, and there's an opportunity to promote that approach worldwide. So Canada has been using a tool that many of you know, a gender-based comparative analysis, which allows us to assess programs and initiatives with respect to the experience of men and women and people that identify differently, by also looking at intersectionality. We referred to the importance of taking demographics into account. So when we use an approach that's gender-based, it helps highlight any shortcomings and allows us to have a more holistic approach that helps us fight disinformation and to be better prepared for upcoming crises. And with respect to a multilateral approach to collaboration, Canada is a leader in international organizations through many initiatives that are tied to gender equality and to security. So I'd just like to hear your ideas with respect to your experience on opportunities to better integrate these points of view. In other words, using this gender-based analysis in order to prepare to upcoming crises or future crises, and how to use that to fight disinformation and misinformation. Thank you very much for the question. I think that it's a fascinating question, and it touches upon a really important academic topic, people's sensitivity to disinformation. There are three broad themes in research. Firstly, network effects, that's what I do. So how do influencers lead to disinformation? How does the disinformation run through influencers that can short circuit and develop issues? And to a degree, through my work with AHS on COVID-19, we began developing demographic segmentation in social media to try and find influencers in those communities, racialized, indigenous, and to try and find partners that were trustworthy to those communities. We were hopeful that one of the main problems was lack of trust in public institutions. So we thought if we find influencers that are trusted by their communities, it might be easier to advance our common goals. And I think that it was really important. It's been really useful. Calgary and the eastern part of Calgary is a very diverse community. A lot of South Asians, and 99% of people are vaccinated in that specific riding. And it is all thanks to community-based efforts and interactions with the local community. Same with Indigenous communities. Indigenous nations in Alberta have been very active, and they've had a lot of contact with local health authorities. However, we don't have a specific understanding, we don't have evidence on the impact of such factors. Really, we don't know if gender has an impact in the way, for instance, people perceive information. Do certain groups see these issues differently? And I think that we're trying to develop that capacity, but we don't have a gender-based gender-based analysis. Now, I am part of the Minds group on defense and security, and there will be a colloquium, a symposium in 2022, and it's with respect to disinformation in a multicultural society. What does it mean to rethink information and disinformation in a community that's diverse and for whom inclusivity and equity are important? And we're trying to think about those issues that are fundamental in our opinion. Secondly, some of us just came back from Europe. We're probably the only to go for a while, in fact. And my colleague, Jonathan Paquin, I see at the back of the room, was with me. So one of the things that we unveiled very quickly was that in NATO, there's a lack of thought about diversity, and there's a lack of people that are thinking about diversity. They haven't really transitioned between intersectionality, diversity, and it's beginning, but it's not complete. And I think that Canada certainly leads the pack and should be present on those issues. And I think it will also cause problems with our allies at NATO. When Canada decides to have a transgender commander, it's not clear that other nations will want to work with them. There will be a joint operations issue at that level. So whether it's NATO or its member states, these are things that have yet to improve. I think we need to understand how diversity issues will affect us in the future and how they affect these communities currently. Thank you very much. We'll conclude our panel now. It was a really thoughtful panel, and I encourage you to continue talking during the break. Thank you very much, Professor Bélanger, Chantal, and Mr. Jean. Professor Boucher, thank you very much for your thoughts and your insights with respect to have incentives for transparency, to draw lessons from our experience, to be understanding of our situation here and abroad. Thank you very much for everything you've done. And now we'll take a break. We'll be back at 11:30, where we will hear the former ambassador and permanent representative to the North Atlantic Council, Carrie Buck.